Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon, Arnold Zable. Arnold is an acclaimed writer, educator, human rights advocate, and one of Australia's most loved storytellers. His books include Jewels and Ashes, The Fig Tree, and 3 novels. His most recent work, Violin Lessons, is a book of stories based on his travels. He is the author of numerous feature articles, columns, essays, short stories, and works for theatre. He's been a visiting lecturer and a writer in residence at a range of universities and has presented extensively at writers' festivals and conferences throughout Australia and overseas. He has worked in a range of cross-cultural projects and conducted workshops for many groups, including refugees, immigrants, the homeless, the hearing impaired, Black Saturday bushfire survivors, and problem gamblers, using story as a means of self-understanding. He is a patron of the Sanctuary Australia Foundation, an ambassador of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne, president of the Melbourne Centre of International PEN, and a former member of the Victorian Immigration Museum Advisory Committee. He has a doctorate from the School of Creative Arts, Melbourne University, where he has been appointed a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. And Arnold is here today to talk to us about the healing power of story. Will you join with me in welcoming Arnold?
Thank you for that introduction. It actually made me feel old. I don't usually feel old. I actually feel very young most of the time, and I know you can feel young right up until what is, I guess, biologically an old age. And maybe that's what we're here to discuss. Maybe that's the underlying thing when it comes to the power of story, because I've noticed time and time again that people actually become enlivened and even younger when they start to tell their stories. Have you noticed that? It's quite extraordinary. I've become more and more acutely aware of this. And so I wanted to begin with a couple of stories, very recent examples that have come my way, and that actually illustrate this. And before I say anything else, the heart of storytelling is imagination. But the word imagination is very often misunderstood. It's not making something up. It comes from the word image, imagination. So imagination actually means seeing it. The question you ask someone is not, what do you feel? That's the question that's asked so often. How do you feel today? Well, no. When it comes to story, the first question is, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell, taste, touch? You're asking people to get in touch again with something that's very, very sensual. Storytelling is actually very sensual. And this has been very dramatically illustrated recently for me with conversations I'm having with a woman who is 95 years old. She will only converse on the phone because she says, I don't want you to see me. She lives in a flat in Elwood, and I live on the other side of the city, but she won't allow me to see her. I did know her a long time ago, and she's actually very well known. I won't say who she is. Well, she's well known to the Jewish community in Melbourne, and was once well known. She's been actually forgotten in many ways, and she has an extraordinary story to tell. Now, whenever I ring her up, and she wants me to ring her up, but whenever I ring her up, usually about 9 o'clock at night, she just sounds, but it doesn't matter when you ring up, she just sounds so tired, so weary, and angry too sometimes. There's a lot of anger in her. And as you know, anger in older people is not uncommon. But invariably, once she starts talking and I start asking those questions, she becomes enlivened and her voice starts to become younger. So maybe it helps that we're talking on the phone to really realise what the impact of storytelling is. And you know, time and time again, she's going back to a particular time in her life. She sees it with such clarity. We're going back 85 years, that's right. She's about 10 years old and she's hurrying home and she comes through the gateway into a courtyard with cobblestone courtyard and she says, I'm so fast, my body is so lithe and light. She actually became a dancer in later years. And she said, and I'm stepping over the stepping stones. She can see that there are actually two little stones and a major stepping stones that lead through the door into the tenement. And there are 4 stories to the tenement, and she's running up the rotting wooden stairs. On the first floor, by day, there are boys chanting in a cheder, a study house for religious Jewish boys, and she hears them chanting, or sometimes she sees them flying out with their little locks, you know, hanging out to the sides, and they're sitting on the rotten stairs playing dominoes and chess. But she's running up those stairs, and she says at a certain point, I'm flying up those stairs. And she gets to the 4th floor, and she turns into the corridor, and she goes past all the familiar doors of neighbours, and then she comes to the last door, which is actually fronting her, and it's the door to the attic. She lives in the attic. She lives in the attic now. When she walks through the streets of Elwood, often she's back in the attic. And the door opens, and it opens into a kitchen, directly into a kitchen. And in the kitchen, there is a bed for the servant, and there is a stove and a table, and her mother is standing by the table, and she's gutting a fish. And she says, there's something pulsating in that fish. I can see it now, it's pulsating. I felt nauseated. Is that the fish's heart that's pulsating? And then she goes into the first of 3 rooms, and the first room is 2 beds end to end, and that's where she sleeps and her brother sleeps. And the brother and sister go to the window, and all you can see from the attic is a blue sky and the steeple of a church. And the church bells are ringing, and she begins singing. And her brother sings too. It's a game they played when they were very young. He's 3 years younger. And he now lives in Tel Aviv at the age of 92. And she's singing, and they're singing in harmony with the bells of the church. It's a game they played, and they keep singing until the church bells drown their voices. And then there's a table, and she says it's a friendly table. It's a table we used to sit at when we were together as a family, mother, father, and the 2 children. And then she goes to the next room, and in the next room there is a grand piano and a harmonium. And her mother is sitting by the harmonium, and she's singing as she plays the harmonium, and she's singing the Lorelei by Schubert, because once she had been a mezzo-soprano and a singer, and now she lives in the attic. Is it beginning to sound like a fairy tale? But this is true, utterly true. I last spoke to her 3 nights ago. And then she says that you go into the next room, and the next room is her father's room. Mother and father sleep apart. And on the wall there is the one image hanging on the walls of the house, and it's a portrait, an etching of Baruch Spinoza, the famous philosopher. And she said, when we were children, we thought he was such a beautiful Spinoza, with long hair hanging down to the shoulders. Now, another thing I want to say here is, it's not only the story, but the way it's told. Remember that. It's the way she's telling it. And it's magical. Magic, image, imagination, there are connections with all these things. And she says that, but for her mother mocks the father, who is a poet, a Yiddish poet, and she calls the portrait a Spinozel, right? And but the Spinoza is looking down at the typewriter that her father, who's a rather famous Yiddish writer at the time, is busy typing away and looking up at the Spinoza. But there's something else there too, a black crucifix. I only found this out last Thursday night. I've been talking to her on the phone for the last 18 months, every couple of weeks. There's always something else that is remembered, this black crucifix. And she remembers that they were on a horse and cart and they were going through the Polish countryside, and in the mud there was this black crucifix, and her father jumped off the wagon and took it, and it went with him on all these journeys, and so on and so forth. Now, I could tell this story for the next hour, but and every time I ring her, something new comes to her mind, but comes to her vision, to her seeing and her hearing. And it's an extraordinary example of imagination at work. But the most important thing is that at a certain point she says, "Oh, I feel so light and so happy." Every time we talk, she gets to that point. She's lifted and she's enlivened. Now, I've got many, many examples of this kind of thing. I think I might tell you one or two others. Olive, beautiful Olive, in January this year, she was dying. She was 98 years old, a close family friend. And I went to visit her in hospital, and I just can't resist it. We were talking, and I said to her a question I love asking older people. I said, "Close your eyes, and what do you see? What's the earliest thing in your life that you see?" And she says, it's 1917, I think. She's just a little girl of about 5 or something, 4, and she's at a party. And she said, at this party, she sees that half the people there are crying and half of them are laughing, it seems. You know, because half have been reunited with young men returning from the First World War, and the other half are grieving. And she said, "I thought I have to figure this out, so I have to find a place where I can figure this out." And she said she looked and looked and looked, a place where I could be alone, and the only place she could find was apparently this house had 2 brick chimneys sticking out, and in the middle she felt that she was kind of, unseen. And there she could try to figure out this great mystery of life. I said, "What's the next thing you see?" She says, about 2 years later, this is down in Tasmania, in a town called Scottsdale, and she says 2 years later, she is her next memory, where she's getting up pre-dawn, just as the sun is about to rise, with her older brother, and they steal out of the house, and they are running up the hill, and the mists are beginning to lift from the hill. She can see the mists. And she said, "We're going out in search of the Tasmanian tiger," and so on and so forth. Once again, can you see it all comes from the seeing and from being there, from actually going back there. And once again, she's no longer, well, for that moment, she's no longer an old woman dying. She's alive. And she's totally present to the memory and to the story. Another wonderful story I love to tell is back in 1994, my wife, whose family comes from the island of Ithaca, between Italy and Greece, whose story I tell in a novel called Sea of Many Returns. And she said to me, "Grand Aunt Maria is turning 100 years 100 years old this weekend." So I said to her, "Well, look, I'd love to meet her." So we go to this Greek old age home, I think it's called Pronya, in Melbourne, in Oakley. And, I'm just intrigued to see what she looks like. And she's walking, a nurse is helping her towards me, and she's small and shriveled. But then when she was about a metre away, I noticed she had a pair of dynamic blue eyes. I didn't think anyone so old could have such extraordinary eyes. And as if she could read my mind, she sat down and she told me the following story. She said, 82 years ago, when I was 18 years old, I came to Melbourne. I landed in Port Melbourne. My brother, that's my wife's late maternal grandfather, Con Kikatos, my brother, who arrived a couple of years earlier, picked me up at Port Melbourne, and he took me in a horse and cart to the centre of the city, to Burke Street, and to a Greek tailor's. The very first day she arrived, and he said to the tailor, I want you to make a dress that matches my sister's blue eyes and her long blonde hair. So time disappears and you're looking at something else entirely. And then she smiles and she said, you made me such a great dress. I fell in love in that dress for the first time. I went to great Greek parties in that dress. She said it was blue with gold embroidery on the edges. And sometimes it's a little bit sadder in a way. I've got a friend called Tony Knight, an extraordinary person, perhaps my closest friend. He was my phys ed teacher when I went to Princess Hill High School years ago, and ended up becoming a professor of education. An extraordinary life he's led, and he's now in his mid to late 70s. But a few years ago I was visiting him, and he said, I want to show you my most precious possession. And he brought out a cigarette tin. Now, objects tell stories. One of the most extraordinary ways to elicit stories, the blue dress. Very often, the black crucifix. In every story, there's always an object, or almost always an object, and objects can trigger off stories. And so he brought out the cigarette tin. He said, underneath he scratched May 13, 1913, I think. Now his father, he said, was born in 1900. So he may have been 13 years old when he got this tin. The way Tony got the tin was that when his father died a couple of years earlier, they'd gone to their house where they'd grown up. I think there were 7 brothers and sisters, and they began arguing over who should have what. And he said, I just wanted to remember my father. He liked to smoke, so he grabbed this cigarette tin, and he liked to drink, so he grabbed this copper bottle opener, and that was enough. And a few days later, he picked up the tin, and something was shaking inside. So he opens up the tin, and out fall about, I think there was something like 30 black and white photos that had been squashed into the tin. He never knew these photos existed. So here already it's kind of too late. He didn't know they existed. What are they? They are photographs taken by a young man in 1917 on the battlefields of Western Europe. He'd actually taken photos. You have 3 young men with just a penciled label in the back. 3 young men in gas masks, or Billy Hughes in London addressing the troops. And just the traces in a burnt out cathedral, a cannon on a battlefield, and the name of a place. And this began a journey for the son to try to retrace his father's tracks. But his father only ever said one thing about the war. He said, I hate war. I don't want to see my sons going to war, because once after a battle, I came across a field of dead and dying German soldiers, and I realised they were kids just like me. So it's a very profound statement, but this whole story was never said. And Tony used to say to me that one thing he noticed about these older Australian men, when they got together, when his father got together with his mates, they just sat there, they didn't talk much. Now there may be something in that, but it's interesting that I think there a lot of people just don't talk, and perhaps if they did talk, it may help them what? It may help them express themselves. I mean, what does expression actually mean? Expression actually means getting it out. I began writing because when I was a kid, there was chaos and madness in the house. You know, I was living in a house of ghosts. My mum and my father were arguing, but mainly it was my mother was in a kind of psychic rage. This is a story I've told in my memoir, Jewels and Ashes. and also in a novel, Scraps of Heaven, where she becomes a fictional character. But basically it's about a woman who never forgave herself because she lost her parents and her brothers and sisters in the Holocaust. And my father lost his entire family, but he was very different. He didn't feel it the way she did. And she used to go into psychic rages about the unfairness of the world and worse, far worse. And this chaos was too much for me as a child. So I remember I used to get very angry. And one day I walked into the bedroom and I sat down, and for some reason they were raging in the kitchen. All the fights, everything in a migrant home takes place in the kitchen, in Greek families and Jewish families and Italian families as I knew them then. And they're raving away, and then and I'm sitting in the bedroom and I'm just so angry, and for some reason I began to write. I don't remember what I wrote, but what I remember very clearly to this day is that after 10 minutes I got up and I felt light. When I walked into that room, I felt heavy. When I left, I felt light, as if nothing could get to me. I had discovered expression, exit. When you go to the Greek island of Ithaca, you don't say cheers, you say exo tavasana, outside with my problems. Ex is a Greek prefix meaning out, and expression means getting it out. So this is what it actually is, getting it out. Now, the amazing thing is, anyone who's attempted to write, and even telling the story as Ruth, I said her name, as this person does, in that apartment in Elwood, even when telling it orally, but also when you write, especially when you write, you begin in chaos, but you begin to work it out. Have you noticed that? I mean, what is a novel? What is a book? It's just working something out. What is a story? You've worked something out. And so first there is the getting it out, and in the process you begin to work it out. What's another way of looking at it? I first gave this talk in Launceston at the first Better Practice conference earlier this year, and then I was asked to speak at another gathering to do with older people, and I remembered something, and I've added this to the talk. I remembered that when I was at university, my favourite, I studied psychology for a while, and my favourite psychologist, psychoanalyst, or whatever, was Erickson. I loved Erickson, and I loved in particular his 8 stages of psychosocial development. And in each stage there is an opposition. What is the negative and what is the positive side of that particular stage of development? And when it comes to the age of 65 and onwards, the final stage, the central psychosocial conflict is integrity or ego integrity versus despair. That's the final battle, integrity versus despair. Did I live a meaningful life? And I'll just quote, integrity versus despair is the 8th and final stage of Erickson's theory of psychosocial development. This stage occurs during late adulthood from age 65 through to the end of life. During this period of time, people reflect back on the life they have lived and come away with either a sense of fulfillment from a life well lived or a sense of regret and despair over a life misspent. Those who feel proud of their accomplishments will feel a sense of integrity. Successfully completing this phase means looking back with few regrets and a general feeling of satisfaction. These individuals will attain wisdom even when confronting death. Those who feel proud of their accomplishments will feel a sense of integrity. Successfully completing this phase means looking back with few regrets and a general feeling of satisfaction. These individuals will attain wisdom even when confronting death. Those who are unsuccessful during this phase will feel that their life has been wasted and will experience many regrets. The individual will be left with feelings of bitterness and despair. Now, there is a qualification. It's a roulette wheel. As you know, I may succumb to dementia or Alzheimer's. I don't know. So I don't want to make this. I think this statement has got its qualifications. However, I also have a little critique of this statement. As a storyteller, I've come to see that the issue of whether you feel a sense of integrity or despair may come down to the fact that you have or have not told your story, worked through your story. Because often, what is integrity? Integrity is fitting the pieces together, integrating your long life. And the act of storytelling can be an act of regaining a sense of integrity, a narrative of your life that begins to give a sense of order and symmetry to the life that you have lived. I mean, that's what stories are all about. And the power of story, you know, following this line of thought, was brought home to me. The empowerment that comes from story was brought home to me when I was running workshops for Black Saturday bushfire survivors. After the Black Saturday fires, I became aware that through people who were working in Alexandra at the library, a very, very beautiful community library, the centre, the hub of activity in that town, in the centre of the bushfire areas. And they told me that people were coming in every day and they just wanted to talk and they wanted to tell their stories, or others were very confused and angry. And so we worked out a project which lasted almost 2 years. And every month I'd come up to one of 6 different places and run a 3-hour writing workshop in the morning, and in the afternoon I would record the stories of those who wanted to tell their stories. And one day it was in the town of Flowerdale, beautiful town, that one day one of these participants came to me and said, look, this is more powerful for me than counselling. And I said, what do you mean? She says, well, counselling's been good, I appreciate it, but sometimes I feel like a victim or a client. But when I write my stories and tell them, I'm in charge. I feel that I'm in charge. I'm making sense of it. It's active. I'm not passive. This is the problem, isn't it? As soon as you begin to feel that passivity, you're on the way to a kind of, I guess, a kind of almost enslavement or resignation. And she said, I feel in charge. And it was then that I understood the meaning of the word author for the first time. Author comes from the word authority. An author is an authority, or should be, I guess, on what they are writing about. And who is the best authority on a life than the person who has lived it? Who is the best authority on what it is to go through a bushfire but the person who has gone through it? And so this is what it comes down to. And with the bit of time remaining, I want to throw out a few more concepts and perhaps things that may be useful in your own work if you're working with story. And the first concept I want to bring up is a wonderful distinction made between 2 major types of storyteller. This appears in an essay by Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin was a social critic. At the height of his powers, he was writing in the 1930s. And he has a book that's still in print called Illuminations. And in one of those essays, there's an essay called The Storyteller. And in this essay, he makes a distinction between 2 types of storytellers. He said the first is what he calls the merchant seaman. This is the person who has gone on a long journey. It could be Odysseus leaving the island of Ithaca and thinking he's going to be away for a year to fight the Trojan Wars and doesn't come back for 20 years. To that very island of Ithaca that my wife's family comes from. Or it could be Gilgamesh or Jason going into the Black Sea in search of the Golden Fleece. It could be Marco Polo coming back from Italy with the recipe for pasta. from China with the recipe for pasta, which is actually what happened. And, or it could be any one of us going on long journeys and coming back with slides that no one wants to watch. And what sort of storyteller? This is the merchant seaman. Now, these stories, Benjamin points out, are essentially spatial. They go from place to place. Look at the places I've been to, the places I've seen, and you come back with the lore, L-O-R-E, the lore of faraway places. Now, the second type of storyteller is often overlooked. And to let you know what that sort of storyteller is, I'll tell you a very short story. Dora and I are on the island of Ithaca in 1991, the first of our prolonged stays. We'd go there to stay for 3 months, 4 months on end, and we became known. Everyone's got a parachukli, a nickname, because there's often not only 5 Yanis in a village, but 5 Yani Rigoses or whatever. And so you have to have a nickname. And we were known as Metapodya, which means with the feet. They thought we were crazy because we walked everywhere. And one glorious morning, we were at a monastery called Kathara, which is at the highest mountain on the island. And it's an old monastery, centuries old. And goats and cows are wandering around outside. It's a magnificent place. And we thought, look, it's such a beautiful day. We'll walk the 4 kilometres down to the mountain village of Anoyi. And after about 20 minutes, the skies had turned black and the heavens opened up, and the goats we'd seen on the way up were hidden behind the clouds. And it began to pour, and we took out our umbrellas and they were torn to shreds, and we only had 2 alternatives, either to laugh or weep. So we laughed hysterically until we came to the village, and we went to the first door and knocked on the door, and 10 minutes later we're sitting in front of the fire and our clothes are drying, and now the woman who answered the door was 93 years old, and I'm sitting in one of her dear departed's old outfits, and my wife is wearing one of her outfits that smelt of ancestral dust. And she began to tell stories. Now, she said, I found this hard to believe, never left the island. She rarely leaves the village, just to go down to the town of Vati to get supplies sometimes. And yet she could tell stories for days on end. What sort of stories? These are stories about, she knew every family, the history of every family. She knew about the disputes. Families, as well as nations, will kill each other over a metre of dirt where the boundary stone should be. In a way, it's glorified village gossip. She knew about the lovers who eloped and disappeared to distant Australia and ended up in the city of Melbourne. She knew everything about everyone. Now, these stories are, rather than spatial, they are temporal. The name that Walter Benjamin gives to this type of storyteller is beautiful, and it's the name to the final part of my novel, Sea of Many Returns. It's called the resident tiller of the soil. This is the person that's lived in one place for a long period of time, if not their whole life. And the law they bring back is the law, L-O-R-E, of the ancestors. It's the law of the past, of the families. Aboriginal storytellers are magnificent examples of this. Magnificent examples of this. And these stories are handed down through the generations, or they're just based on the fact that people talk and know this particular space. When I wrote my novel, Scraps of Heaven, it's a novel that's set just in the streets of the neighbourhood I grew up in Carlton, and my major informants were old guys in the local pub who lived in that neighbourhood for 40 years, 50 years, or their entire life, and could tell me magnificent stories. So it's a useful way of looking at stories. And most people tell stories that are a bit of both, especially in this day and age, which leads to another thing, and that is, I call this interrogating the story. I've been talking to this woman on the phone for 18 months. It takes the best stories come from a relationship. I have a formula, S equals ER squared. I missed out on E equals MC squared, but I've got S equals ER squared, which means story equals entering into a relationship over a period of time. And really, that's what it takes. Every time I ring this person in Elwood, I get that another image. Last time it was the black crucifix. The time before it was the pulsating fish. Another time was magnificent. She was coming home. She was already a teenage girl. She was coming home, and it was late at night, and she stopped at the gateway. She had to ring a bell for the concierge to come out, and she said, at that moment, I could hear, that's what she said, I could hear everyone sleeping inside the tenement. I could hear their groans and their sighs. I could hear their dreams. She said, I could hear their dreams, and then I had the feeling that the whole city was dreaming, and I could hear their dreamings. Isn't that magnificent? In literature, you would call this magical realism. Gabriel Garcia Marquez writes novels like that. But really, it's another way of seeing things. And so it takes time. And the most important example, the most dramatic, well, a couple of dramatic examples I'll give you of this. And they are extraordinary. And they show how important it is to give stories time and to enter into a relationship. The first one comes from my novel, Café Scheherazade. Café Scheherazade is a novel about people who meet, older people who meet in a cafe in St Kilda that became an institution, an iconic place in Melbourne, in Ackland Street, St Kilda, called Scheherazade. And it's an amazing story as to why it was called Scheherazade. But in the novel there are three types of survivors, three characters I create who encapsulate the types of survivors that emerged from the Second World War. But they are based on real people. They're composite characters based on real people. When I finished writing the novel, it was August 2000, and it was going to go to the printers in December. So I had my last chance to change things, and I showed what I'd written to the people that I'd based my characters on. I said, look, it's become fictionalised, but what's your response? And one of the guys, he said to me, Arnold, everything you have written is correct. This happened, and that happened. He was speaking in Yiddish. He said, all these things happened, but you've completely and utterly missed the point. I said, what? I've missed the point? The novel's coming out soon? What do you mean? And he said, look, there's a word in English. What's the word? I know what the word is. The word is indifference. Indifference. I was 18 years old. I was a slave for the Red Army. I was building surveillance towers in Siberia. No one gave a damn. Every camp commandant, every nachalnik didn't care whether I lived or died. I could have been buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten. He said, you know the story I tell you, you tell it accurately enough. I go out into the forest to cut down a tree, and my workmate and I were working together, and the tree fell the wrong way, and he was killed by my side, and I still limp to this day. What I didn't tell you, and what I've now just remembered, is that the next day a letter arrived from his wife. He'd been waiting for that letter for a long time. And so what did we do? We were a band of about 8 or 9 sex-starved young men with no access to women at all. So we adopted that letter. She became our collective wife. And at night we'd sit around and we'd say, look, if you read this letter, you'll see she was faithful. And the next night we'd say, no, if you read between the lines, you'll see she was unfaithful. And at that point, the hairs began to stick up on the back of your neck because you have entered another level of the story, a deeper level of the story. So I rewrote the chapter. I added that story, of course. But more than that, it was now infused with something else. The stories had to change. The tone had to change. It was too passive. It was now driven by an urgency. And I showed it to him again, and he said, yes, you've got it right. The other example I want to give is one that unfortunately has resonances with what is going on at the moment in a very big way, as people, politicians, in regard to the most vulnerable people, using them as political footballs. Now, this is the final story in my book, my most recent book, Violin Lessons. It concerns a woman called Amal Basri. Amal Basri was one of the 45 survivors and one of the 7 that came to live in Australia and one of the 3 that came to live in Melbourne of the Crucifix disaster when October 19, 2001, 353 men, women and children drowned en route to Christmas Island. Now, she became a much-loved storyteller. She was in her 50s. She survived by clinging to a corpse for 20 hours. She was known as a person who would tell her story to anyone and everyone. I saw her tell that story in front of 2,500 people at the Melbourne Town Hall. She was condemned and cursed to tell that story because she'd been a witness. She had seen the little kids like birds floating on the surface of the ocean. She said, I have to tell this story. I saw what happened. And she was the most beautiful woman, and she, in a cruel irony, she got cancer, and she was stricken with cancer, and she passed away in 2006. And I promised her I'd write a story, and when I sat down to write it, it's called The Ancient Mariner. You know The Ancient Mariner? Coleridge's Ancient Mariner grabs the wedding guests and says, I've got a story to tell and you're going to listen to it whether you like it or not. I have to tell you this story. That's what she was like. And I always knew where I would begin the story as a storyteller. I'd written about it journalistically, but as a storyteller, this is how I begin. When she was born, her mother was upset she had not given birth to a boy. Her father said, I'm not upset, I'm glad I have a daughter. He named her Amal, meaning hope, and he took her to many places in his dark green Morris. Every Friday, the day of rest, he drove her to the Tigris to walk along the banks of the river. As they walked, he sang to her from the repertoire of Kulthum, the grand diva of Arabic music. One morning, as father and daughter were strolling by the Tigris, they came upon a gathering of people dressed in black, weeping. What happened to these people? Amal asked. They have lost their son to the river and they are waiting for his body to rise to the surface, her father replied. Bodies can float, he said. Many years in the ocean, many times I wanted to die, Amal would tell me years later. I was waiting for the angel of death, but I remembered what my father told me and I held on to the body of a woman and I heard music. I heard Kulthum and the songs my father sang when we walked by the Tigris. Maybe this saved me. Now, as I'm writing this story, something is missing. She had a particular voice, a particular way of telling stories, but because her English wasn't that good, but rapidly improving because she was very intelligent, it wasn't working. Having her telling the story in a broken English, all it was doing was infantilizing her. In Arabic, she would have been telling it fluently. So I thought, let me go back. Now, this happens often. And if you're alert to a story, you will see the threads embedded in the story, the threads that may lead you to a deeper understanding. And in this particular story, I went back to the first paragraph, and there it was, Kulthum. She loved Kulthum, the grand diva of Arabic music. She often talked about Kulthum. She once told me she had wanted to be a singer, but it didn't work out that way. She was culturally and in terms of her life's journey. So I did the research. It's always just to Google away these days. And I found out there was a place called the Platinum Desert, a music store in Sydney Road in the northern suburbs of Melbourne where many of the Iraqi and recently arrived refugee communities live. And I went there and I met the young Lebanese musician, Omar, and he said to me, Kulthum, she's still, 35 years after her death or so, the most loved and most bought, her CDs are the most purchased, the most loved singer out here in the northern suburbs. She said, that when she died in Cairo, 4 million people came to her funeral. It was the largest gathering of human beings in one place ever. He said, now listen to the way she sings. And I bought a couple of CDs. He said, listen, we have got a thing in Arabic called tarab. What's tarab? She said, when you, and I could hear it as I drove around. She said, you listen to her sing, she begins quietly. And then she works her way up and up and up, and the rhythm intensifies and intensifies, and the repetition intensifies. And then finally it reaches this point we call tarab, and that's the point when the distinction between the performer and the audience disappears and they become one. And as I'm driving around and I'm listening to this, it was so obvious. This is the way Amal told stories. She always wanted to be a singer, but as a storyteller, this is the way she told them. As the boat went down, I couldn't swim. You see, I couldn't swim. Because I couldn't swim, I didn't dare breathe. And maybe this saved my life, you see. If I would have breathed, I would have taken in water. And when I came to the surface, the gates of hell opened up. I saw men and women. She had this way of telling it that was mesmerising and rhythmic. And so I rewrote the whole story with that rhythm rather than, and had her speaking fluently, basically. And when I showed it to people who'd known her, they said, yes, you've got the voice now, and you've got the way she told the stories. And I wanted to, look, there are so many, many more things that can put about story. It's late, it's only a couple of minutes to go. I want to end, I guess, just with two things. With Amal, in her story, after she died and I was writing it, I realised that she suffered like so many older people in general, not only immigrants. She suffered from what Greeks call nostalgia, which literally means the pain of longing for the return. People can't understand it. They dismiss nostalgia as sentimentality. It isn't. It's a physical ache for those who make the journey. It's a physical ache for those that may have lived in a country town and are now consigned to living in an old age home. It's a physical ache for the past, for what once was. And when we go back to the beginning of my lecture, you hear that, or my talk, it's not a lecture, that this woman is going back 85 years on the telephone. Whenever I ring her, she's back in the time before, even though she's living in the time after. And with Amal, she used to ring me up late at night. She said, Arnold, I can't sleep. And very often she'd get onto a train and make the journey from Broadmeadows all the way into the city. And I recreated that journey. I took the train, I went to the city, and she would walk to, if you know the centre of Melbourne, there is, from Flinders Street, it's just 50 metres or so to Prince's Bridge, the bridge that goes over the river, and she would go down to the river and sit beneath the Moreton Bay figs on a bench at 1 a.m. sometimes and look across the other side. And when you look across the other side of the river, what do you see? Right next to the bridge, a row of palm trees. She was back in Baghdad. She was back by the Tigris River. And the final thing I want to do is just read a couple of paragraphs from the end of Jewels and Ashes, the book in which I trace my family's journey, where I go to Poland in search of the missing link in the ancestral chain. It begins and ends in Melbourne. And when I came back to Melbourne, I heard stories I never heard before, because I now had the maps of my parents' youth, their childhood. So I could trigger off memories in a way I couldn't trigger off before. But when I came to the end, I realised that there is a more subtle language too. And that subtle language is a language of silence. So I'll end with this reading, and I think you'll recognise, if you work with old people, you may recognise this. And sometimes people are telling stories in another way, through their silence. And my mum certainly did, and she did mellow. Her rage did subside when she was older. There is a certain position by the kitchen table from which a window high on the wall opposite the bathroom can be seen. Here Mother often sits and gazes at the upper branches of a tree. Timber frames divide the window into 12 separate squares so that the light streams in at many angles and degrees of intensity. Sometimes it is restrained, the branches barely visible. At other moments, it blazes a luminous gold. In winter, the branches are thin and bare, while in spring they erupt with leaves. In her aging, Mother's life has been reduced to a simple equation, a silence with infinite variations on tranquility and light, concentrated, framed, contained, yet full of subtle movement and change. The silence is rarely broken, except for a sudden gust of wind, the distant barking of a dog, the twittering of birds. They return every year, Mother announces from one of her reveries. Birds can speak, she adds. They have a language of their own. They probably talk about where they have been for the past year. They perch on that tree and chatter to each other. You can hear how pleased they are to be back. Thank you very much. Thank you.